December 1982. Atari is worth over $3 billion. They're selling more products than the entire Hollywood movie industry. Video games are the hottest thing in America. 18 months later, the industry is dead. Stores won't stock games. Companies are bankrupt. And Atari is secretly burying truckloads of unsold cartridges in the New Mexico desert. This is how the fastest growing company in American history killed an entire industry, including itself. It all started with the 38-year-old engineer named Nolan Bushnell. He created Pong 2 paddles, one bouncing ball, the simplest concept imaginable. He put one machine in a bar in Sunnyvale, California, as a test. 2 weeks later, the bar owner called to say the machine was broken. Bushnell drove over, opened it up, and discovered the problem. The coin mechanism was jammed because the box was overflowing with quarters. This wasn't just a game, it was a money printing machine. Bushnell named his company Atari. Within 3 years, he was selling home versions through Sears. By 1977, he released the Atari 2600, the first major console with interchangeable game cartridges. You could swap games and build a library. This was revolutionary. The 2600 turned video games from a novelty into an industry. Space Invaders, Asteroids, Missile Command. These weren't just games. They were cultural phenomena. By 1982, Atari was generating $2 billion in annual revenue. That's more than the entire American film industry. The company was valued at over $3 billion. They were on every magazine cover. Nolan Bushnell was a genius. Except there was a problem. Bushnell had sold the company in 1976. Warner Communications bought Atari for a mere $28 million pocket change compared to what it would become. And Warner was about to make decisions that would destroy everything. Warner saw Atari as a cash machine and pushed for explosive growth. More games, faster, cheaper. Quality became secondary to quantity. But the real problem was that the Atari 2600 had no security system. Anyone could make games for it, and everyone did. By 1982, over 100 companies were pumping out Atari 2600 games. The market was flooded. Store shelves overflowed with titles. Some were good, but most were terrible, and consumers couldn't tell the difference until they got home. Quaker Oats made a video game. So did Purina. Yes, the dog food company. The market was chaos. Then came the first major mistake. In the summer of 1982, Pac-Man was the biggest arcade game on the planet. Atari paid $1 million, huge money at the time, for the home console rights. Warner was so confident it would sell that they manufactured 12 million cartridges. There was just one small problem. Only 10 million people owned an Atari 2600. They literally made more games than there were consoles to play them on. And that wasn't even the worst part. The programmer was given only 5 weeks to port the entire game. The result was a disaster. Pac-Man looked like a deformed pizza slice, the ghosts flickered constantly, and the gameplay was broken. Reviews were brutal, sales were disappointing, and millions of cartridges sat unsold in warehouses. But Atari wasn't done making mistakes. In July 1982, Steven Spielberg's E.T. was the biggest movie in the world. Atari's CEO saw dollar signs and paid $25 million for the exclusive video game rights. The deal was signed in late July, and the game needed to be finished, manufactured, and in stores by Christmas. This gave them about 2 months for development. They assigned it to Howard Scott Warshaw, one of their best programmers. He'd created hits before, but even he said this was impossible. He asked for 6 months. They gave him 5 weeks. What happened next is legendary. Warshaw worked around the clock, building an entire game from scratch, something that should take 6 to 12 months. The game that shipped was broken, confusing, and frustrating. Players controlled E.T., who would randomly fall into pits. You had to collect phone pieces, but the game never explained how or why. Kids were crying, parents were furious. Atari manufactured 5 million copies, expecting it to be the biggest game of the year. They sold about 1.5 million. Another 3.5 million copies sat in warehouses, unsold and unmovable, along with millions of unsold Pac-Man cartridges. Christmas 1982 should have been Atari's greatest triumph. Instead, it was a bloodbath. Retail stores were flooded with unsold inventory from everyone. The entire market was saturated with garbage, and consumers had stopped buying. After Christmas, the return started, with millions of games flooding back to manufacturers. Atari went from billions in revenue to $536 million in losses in a single year. It wasn't just Atari that was dying. It was the entire industry. The video game crash happened fast, and it was brutal. Mattel Electronics, maker of the Intellivision console, shut down completely. Coleco, the other major player, headed toward bankruptcy. Retailers stopped stocking games entirely. Industry revenue dropped from $3.2 billion in 1983 to just $100 million in 1985. That is a 97% collapse. Gaming magazines shut down. The media declared video games a fad that was finally over. Warner Communications was panicking. Atari, their golden goose, was bleeding money fast. In September 1983, Atari had a very practical problem: what to do with millions of unsold game cartridges. Their solution was bizarre. They loaded up trucks with unsold inventory and drove them to a landfill in Alamogordo, New Mexico. There, they dumped truckloads of cartridges, crushed them with a steamroller, and poured concrete over them. They did this in secret, but word got out. For decades, it became an urban legend. Did Atari really bury their failure in the desert? In 2014, a documentary crew got permission to excavate the site. They dug, and they found them thousands of crushed cartridges, still there 30 years later, physical proof of the crash. Warner had seen enough. In 1984, they split Atari in two and sold the consumer division for $240 million, a fraction of its former value. The company that created the video game industry was carved up and sold for parts. The empire was over. Nolan Bushnell, who sold for $28 million back in 1976, watched from the sidelines. He would later admit he sold too early. So what actually killed Atari and the video game industry? 3 fatal flaws. First, no quality control. Atari's open system meant anyone could make games, flooding the market with shovelware until consumers lost trust. Second, greed over craft. Warner pushed for faster, cheaper production, manufacturing games based on projections, not demand. They forgot people buy games because they're fun, not because they exist. And third, disrespecting creators. Atari refused to credit their programmers, who were making them millions. Talented developers left, and quality collapsed. The video game industry didn't actually die in 1983. It learned. When Nintendo launched the NES in America in 1985, they designed it specifically to avoid Atari's mistakes. They implemented a security chip for approved games, limited publishers to 5 games per year, and created the Nintendo seal of quality. Nintendo studied Atari's corpse and built an empire by doing the opposite. Today, the Atari brand still exists, but it's a shadow of its former self. Nolan Bushnell went on to create Chuck E. Cheese and is worth about $50 million today. Successful, but not a billionaire. Howard Scott Warshaw, the E.T. programmer, became a psychotherapist. He's made peace with creating the worst game ever, correctly pointing out that E.T. didn't kill the industry. Atari's business decisions did. And the video game industry? It came back stronger than ever, generating over $180 billion annually today. Atari didn't just fail, they killed an entire industry. The crash happened because a company forgot the basic rule of business: respect your customers and respect your craft. Those buried cartridges in New Mexico aren't just trash. They're a monument to what happens when you prioritize short-term profits over long-term quality. Atari created video games, then destroyed them, losing $3 billion and changing the industry forever. The lesson? No company is too big to fail, especially when they stop caring about why people love them in the first place. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into business history. We'll see you in the next one.